As I have already mentioned, the rationalist theory of language, which was to prove extremely rich in insight and achievement, developed in part out of a concern with the problem of other minds. A fair amount of effort was devoted to a consideration of the ability of animals to follow spoken commands, to express their emotional states, to communicate with one another, and even apparently to cooperate for a common goal. All of this, it was argued, could be accounted for on mechanical grounds, as this notion was then understood. That is, through the functioning of physiological mechanisms in terms of which one could formulate the properties of reflexes, conditioning and reinforcement, association, and so on. Animals do not lack appropriate organs of communication, nor are they simply lower along some scale of general intelligence. In fact, as Descartes himself quite correctly observed, language is a species-specific human possession. It is a human invention. And even at low levels of intelligence, at pathological levels, we find a command of language that is totally unattainable by an ape that may, in other respects, surpass a human imbecile in problem-solving ability and other adaptive behavior. I will return later to the status of this observation in the light of what is now known about animal communication. There is a basic element lacking in animals, Descartes argued, as it is lacking in even the most complex automation that develops its intellectual structures completely in terms of conditioning and association, namely Juan Huarte's second type of wit, the generative ability that is revealed in the normal human use of language as a free instrument of thought. If by experiment we convince ourselves that another organism gives evidence of the normal creative use of language, we must suppose that it, like us, has a mind and that what it does lies beyond the bounds of mechanical explanation, outside the framework of the stimulus response or SR psychology of the time, which in relevant essentials is not significantly different from that of today, though it falls short in sharpness of technique and scope and reliability of information. It should not be thought, incidentally, that the only Cartesian arguments for the best beast machine hypothesis were those derived from the apparent inability of animals to manifest the creative aspect of language use. There were also many others, for example, the natural fear of population explosion in the domains of the spirit if every gnat had a soul, or the argument of Cardinal Melchior de Polignac, who argued that the beast machine hypothesis followed from the assumption of the goodness of God, since, as he pointed out, one can see how much more humane is the doctrine that animals suffer no pain. These examples are taken from the excellent study by Leonora Cohen Rosenfeld, From Beast Machine to Man Machine. The quotes are her paraphrases of the original. Or there is in the argument of Louis Racine, son of the dramatist, who was struck by the following insight, quote, if beasts had souls and were capable of feelings, would they show themselves insensible to the affront and injustice done them by Descartes? Would they not rather have risen up in wrath against the leader and the sect which so degraded them? End quote. One should add, I suppose, that this was regarded as living proof that a brilliant father could not have a brilliant son, but the fact is that the discussion of the existence of other minds, and in contrast to the mechanical nature of animals, continually returned to the creative aspect of language use, to the claim that, as formulated by another minor 17th century figure, if beasts reasoned, they would be capable of true speech with its infinite variety. Of course, it is important to understand just what properties of language were most striking to Descartes and his followers. The discussion of what I have been calling the creative aspect of language use turns on three important observations. The first is that the normal use of language is innovative, in the sense that much of what we say in the course of normal language use is entirely new, not a repetition of anything that we have heard before, and not even similar in pattern, in any useful sense of the terms similar in pattern, to sentences or discourse that we have heard in the past. This is a truism, but it is a pertinent one, often overlooked and not infrequently denied in the behaviorist period of linguistics to which I referred earlier, when it was almost universally claimed that a person's knowledge of language is representable as a stored set of patterns overlearned through constant repetition and detailed training, with innovation being at most a matter of analogy. The fact surely is, however, that the number of sentences in one's native language that one will immediately understand with no feeling of difficulty or strangeness is astronomical, and that the number of patterns underlying our normal use of language and corresponding to meaningful and easily comprehensible sentences in our language is orders of magnitude greater than the number of seconds in a lifetime. It is in this sense that the normal use of language is innovative. However, in the Cartesian view, even animal behavior is potentially infinite in its variety, in the special sense in which the readings of a speedometer can be said, with an obvious idealization, to be potentially infinite in variety. That is, if animal behavior is controlled by external stimuli or internal states, the latter internal states, including those established by conditioning, then as the stimuli vary over an indefinite range, so may the behavior of the animal. But the normal use of language is not only innovative and potentially infinite in scope, but also free from the control of detectable stimuli, either external or internal. It is because of this freedom from stimulus control that language can serve as an instrument of thought and self-expression, as it does not only for the exceptionally gifted and talented, but also in fact for every normal human being. Still, the properties of being unbounded and free from stimulus control do not in themselves exceed the bounds of mechanical explanation. And Cartesian discussion of the limits of mechanical explanation therefore took note of a third property of the normal use of language, namely its coherence and its appropriateness to the situation, which of course is an entirely different matter from control by external stimuli. Just what appropriateness and coherence may consist in, we cannot say in any clear or definite way, but there is no doubt that these are meaningful concepts. We can distinguish normal use of language from the ravings of a maniac or the output of a computer with a random element. Honesty forces us to admit that we are as far today as Descartes was 3 centuries ago from understanding just what enables a human to speak in a way that is innovative, free from stimulus control, and also appropriate and coherent. This is a serious problem that the psychologist and biologist must ultimately face, and that cannot be talked out of existence by invoking habit or conditioning or natural selection. The Cartesian analysis of the problem of other minds in terms of the creative aspect of language use and similar indications of the limits of mechanical explanation was not entirely satisfactory to contemporary opinion. Bayle's dictionary, for example, cites the inability to give a satisfactory proof of the existence of other minds as the weakest element in the Cartesian philosophy, and there was a long and intriguing series of discussions regarding the problems that Descartes raised. From the vantage point of several centuries, we can see that the debate was inconclusive. The properties of human thought and human language emphasized by the Cartesians are real enough. They were then, as they are now, beyond the bounds of any well-understood kind of physical explanation. Neither physics nor biology nor psychology gives us any clue as to how to deal with these matters. And as in the case of other intractable problems, it is tempting to try another approach, one that might show the problem to be misconceived, the result of some conceptual confusion. This is a line of argument that has been followed in contemporary philosophy, but it seems to me without success. It is clear that the Cartesian understood, as well as Gilbert Ryle and other contemporary critics understand, the difference between providing criteria for intelligent behavior on the one hand and providing an explanation for the possibility of such behavior on the other. But, as distinct from Ryle, they were interested in the latter problem as well as the former. As scientists, they were not satisfied with the formulation of experimental tests that would show the behavior of another organism to be creative in the special sense just outlined. They were also troubled, and quite rightly so, by the fact that the abilities indicated by such tests and observational criteria transcend the capacities of corporeal bodies as they understood them, just as they are beyond the scope of physical explanation as we understand it today. There is surely nothing illegitimate in an attempt to go beyond elaboration of observational tests and collection of evidence to the construction of some theoretical explanation for what is observed, and this is just what was at stake in the Cartesian approach to the problem of mind. And as some have insisted, it is necessary to go beyond what one can perceive or imagine in the technical classical sense of this term, if one hopes to understand the nature, just as Newton did successfully in trying to understand the nature of planetary motions. On the other hand, the proposals of the Cartesians were themselves of no real substance. The phenomena in question are not explained satisfactorily by attributing them to an active principle called mind, the properties of which are not developed in any coherent or comprehensive way. It seems to me that the most hopeful approach today is to describe the phenomena of language and of mental activity as accurately as possible, to try to develop an abstract theoretical apparatus that will, as far as possible, account for these phenomena and reveal the principles of their organization and functioning, without attempting, for the present time, to relate the postulated mental structures and processes to any physiological mechanisms or to interpret mental function in terms of physical causes. We can only leave open for the future the question of how these abstract structures and processes are realized or accounted for in some concrete terms, conceivably in terms that are not within the range of physical processes as presently understood, a conclusion that, if correct, should surprise no one. This rationalist philosophy of language merged with various other independent developments in the 17th century, leading to the first really significant general theory of linguistic structure, namely the general point of view that came to be known as philosophical or universal grammar. Unfortunately, philosophical grammar is very poorly known today. There are few technical or scholarly studies, and these few are apologetic and disparaging. References to philosophical grammar in modern treatises on language are also so distorted as to be quite worthless. Even a scholar with such high standards as Leonard Bloomfield gives an account of philosophical grammar in his major work, Language, that bears almost no resemblance to the original and attributes to this tradition views diametrically opposed to those that were most typical of it. For example, Bloomfield and many others describe philosophical grammar as based on a Latin model, as prescriptive, as showing no interest in the sounds of speech, as given to a confusion of speech with writing. All these charges are false, and it is important to dispel these myths in order to make possible an objective evaluation of what was actually accomplished. It is particularly ironic that philosophical grammar should be accused of a Latin bias. In fact, it is significant that the original works, the Port Royal Grammar and Logic in particular, were written in French, the point being that they formed part of the movement to replace Latin by the vernacular. The fact that Latin was at one point in time regarded as an artificial and distorted language, one positively injurious to the exercise of the plain thinking and common sense discourse by which the Cartesians set such store. The practitioners of philosophical grammar used such linguistic materials as were available to them. It is noteworthy that some of the topics that were studied with the greatest care and persistence for well over a century involved points of grammar that do not even have an analog in Latin.